Not every disaster begins with an explosion. Some of the biggest turning points in human history open with something far more terrifying. Silence. A silence so thick people mistake it for peace. And in that exact moment when the heart tells itself everything is fine, when there are no warning signs at all, the deepest test of faith begins to take shape. Try to picture that feeling. Not being attacked, not being chased, not being threatened, just nothing. No reply, no sign from above, no familiar call that once shook your soul to the core. The silence stretches on so long that a question starts to rise in you. Is anyone still listening? There was a moment in history when the greatest man to ever walk this earth faced that exact silence. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the one who had been wrapped in the light of revelation, the one who had heard words from the unseen that changed the destiny of humanity, was suddenly placed into a space he had never known before. No angel, no new verses, no familiar connection between heaven and the heart. This was not the silence of people toward people. This was the silence between the heart and Allah, and there is almost no trial that can make a person tremble more than that. Because when Allah is silent, every familiar idea of faith feels like it collapses. A person can survive loss. A person can survive pain. A person can even survive the hostility of the entire world. But when prayer seems unanswered, when the sky gives no response, the most frightening thought appears. What if I have been abandoned? That was the quiet, heavy question hanging in the air of those days. No one said it out loud, but it lived inside every breath, inside every glance lifted toward the sky. That silence was not just an emptiness outside. It was a deep valley opening inside, a trial that did not strike the body but aimed straight at the core of belief. And what made this trial even more terrifying is that it had no shape, no enemy to confront, no answer to cling to. Only waiting that kept stretching out, day after day, week after week, month after month. A kind of waiting that forces you to face yourself in your most exposed, most vulnerable state. Right here, faith is no longer just words. It is no longer that early rush of emotion. Faith gets stripped down, tested by fire, placed inside silence to see how long it can stand when there is no comfort coming from the outside. If you have ever prayed and felt no response, if you have ever felt Allah seem far away, if you have ever wondered whether what you believe is still being heard, then this story is not foreign to you, because this is not only the story of someone in the past. It is a pattern for what the human soul faces when it enters the darkest zone of the faith journey. Before we go deeper, welcome to Prophetic History Explained, where we explore the most profound, painful, and sacred moments in the lives of the prophets. Not only to learn what happened back then, but to understand what is happening inside us today. And if you are looking for stories that do more than inform, stories that reach the heart, heal the quiet spaces in faith, and help you understand the bond between the human being and Allah, subscribe to support this work. Your support is what keeps these deeper, more honest stories coming. Because what you are about to hear is not mainly the story of how Allah was silent. It is the story of why that silence was necessary, and how it prepared the heart of the greatest man for an even greater light that was still ahead. That silence did not stay outside. It seeped inward slowly like a heavy fog settling over the soul. And that is where the real test began. Not in people's stares, not in the mockery of society, but in the quiet conversation between a man and his own heart. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did not lose faith in Allah. That never happened. But in the months when revelation paused, another kind of pain appeared, more subtle and harder to name, self-questioning. Not, is Allah still there, but am I still worthy? That kind of question only shows up in hearts that take their mission seriously. hearts carrying a weight so enormous they start to fear they themselves might not be enough. Picture that. A man who once touched the most sacred light, who heard words that shook the course of history, now living with the memory of that light while not knowing if it would ever return. Sometimes memory hurts more than absence, because every time you remember, your heart asks again, was that the end? In that quiet stretch, the prophet, peace be upon him, kept praying. But his prayer now had a different rhythm. It was no longer the first shock of wonder, no longer the overwhelming awe of the earliest moments of revelation. It became the urgent call of a heart that waits, that holds on, that hopes inside stillness. And some prayers, even when they are not answered right away, dig deeper roots in faith than any immediate answer ever could. The deepest pain in that season was not doubt. It was a feeling of total aloneness. A man entrusted with a mission for all humanity, yet in that moment no one could truly understand what was happening inside him. Others could see a prophet quiet and thoughtful, but only he could feel the crushing weight of waiting without knowing where the waiting ends. And along with that loneliness came responsibility. A small community had placed their trust in him. They searched his eyes for steadiness, his words for direction. But how do you guide others when you yourself are walking through darkness? This is the cruelest paradox of spiritual leadership. You have to be a refuge, even while your own hands are trembling. This is where the prophet's humanity becomes unmistakably clear, not as a distant symbol without emotion, but as a real human being living with concern, with waiting, with long nights that offered no explanation. Greatness is not never feeling pain. Greatness is refusing to turn away from Allah even when the pain is prolonged and silent. Some nights when Mecca fell quiet, that heaviness became even sharper. In the stillness of the mountains, when ordinary noise disappears, only the heartbeat remains and the thoughts you cannot push away. In moments like that, a person cannot run from the biggest question of life. Who am I when every familiar comfort has been removed? This season teaches a lesson few people want to face. Faith is not always fed by safety. Sometimes it is forged by uncertainty. Not to destroy it, but to reveal its core. A faith that only survives when life feels easy is a faith that has never been tested. But a faith that stands in silence is a faith that has walked through fire. And through all of that inner struggle, the prophet, peace be upon him, never stopped turning toward Allah. Even without new signs, even without clear reassurance from the heavens, he kept facing the same direction. That quiet steadfastness, unseen, unpraised, became the foundation for everything that came later. Because sometimes Allah does not stay silent to take something away, but to show what remains when everything else is stripped. When there is no new revelation, no obvious external support, what remains is the pure bond between the heart and the Creator. And in that darkness, endurance, humility, and total dependence on Allah are formed. This was not a season of failure. It was a season of hidden preparation. A preparation only those willing to face themselves in silence can survive. And from that depth, the light that comes afterward is no longer a brief emotional high. It becomes the light of stability, the light of strength that cannot be shaken. Silence rarely gets left alone. When the heavens do not speak, people speak instead. And compassion is rarely what they choose. More often, they fill the empty space with assumptions, ridicule, and cruelty disguised as logic. In that pause of revelation, the prophet's trial, peace be upon him, moved into an even deeper layer. The silence of Allah was interpreted by the world in the most ruthless way. The people of Mecca did not see the inner struggle. They only saw a man who claimed words from above, now quiet and still. And from that gap, they wrote their own conclusion. Rumors spread not like a shout, but like poisonous smoke. Maybe his Lord has left him. Maybe he has been hated. These were not random comments. They were blades aimed at the most sacred relationship the prophet had. For an ordinary person, an insult might stop at reputation. For the prophet, peace be upon him, these words pierced the heart of his mission. They did not only attack him, they attacked the source of the message he carried. And what made it heavier was that they did not threaten one man alone. They threatened to shake the faith of a fragile newborn community. The believers were not many. They were people who had traded social safety, family acceptance, and sometimes even their lives for a new path. They had found strength in the prophet's steadiness and in the steady flow of revealed verses, like living proof that Allah was guiding step by step. Now, with the sky quiet, their eyes naturally turned to him for reassurance, and that made the burden sharper than ever. The world quickly turned Allah's silence into a verdict. No one waited to understand. No one considered there might be hidden wisdom. They chose the simplest, cruelest explanation. If there are no new words, then maybe the relationship has ended. This is how the world treats the sacred, measuring it by constant visible proof, by what can be seen and heard. In the middle of that storm of voices, the prophet, peace be upon him, did not argue. He did not stand up to defend himself against every insult. His silence was not weakness. It was patience. But even patience needs support. And Allah placed that support close, inside his own home. Khadijah, the one who believed when no one else believed, kept believing when faith was being tested at its most brutal point. She did not debate the mockers. She did not try to win arguments. She chose something deeper and more lasting. She returned the prophet, peace be upon him, to the truth of his own life. Not the truth of rumors, but the truth of the path he had already lived. She reminded him who he had always been. The man who kept family ties, who defended the weak, who helped the poor, who carried other people's burdens without complaint. Those were not temporary emotions. They were the consistent fingerprints of a lifetime. And a life like that could not be the life of someone abandoned by Allah. When the world tried to define silence in the most bitter way, Khadijah's unshakable faith became an invisible shield. She did not need to know when revelation would return. She only knew that Allah does not betray sincere hearts. And sometimes the steady faith of one person is what keeps an entire mission from collapsing. For the small community of believers, that season became a quiet purification. No new verses to lift their spirits, no obvious sign to silence the mockery. Only one question left. What do they believe and why do they believe? Do they believe because of what is happening in front of them, or because of what they have already recognized in their hearts? Here, silence exposes a hard truth. Faith cannot depend entirely on external signs. If it does, it will collapse the moment those signs pause. The world may interpret silence as an ending. But for those who understand the nature of the sacred journey, silence can be the final test before truth is affirmed more powerfully than ever. This season did not create new believers. It refined the believers who already existed. It forced every heart to answer where it truly stands when everything is unclear. And through that quiet separation, the foundation of a community built not on temporary emotion but on deep conviction began to form. And then the moment came. Not loudly, not dramatically the way people imagine heavenly intervention. No thunder, no lightning slicing through the sky over Mecca. Revelation returned not to shock, but to heal. After a long stretch with no known end, something shifted. Not with an obvious sign at first, but with a familiar awareness. One only someone who has tasted revelation can recognize. A presence returning, gentle but firm, soft but unmistakable. And in that moment, the prophet, peace be upon him, knew the silence had completed its purpose. Surah Ad-Duha did not begin as a defense. It did not explain, argue, or answer the world. Allah did not need to. It began with an oath, but not an oath to threaten. An oath to calm the heart. The brightness of morning and the darkness of the night were placed side by side like two breaths of the same journey. Not enemies, not contradictions, but partners, each with its place. A deeper truth is revealed here. Light does not cancel darkness, and darkness has no right to cancel light. Both exist within one plan. People often assume darkness is a mistake, a sign of abandonment. This surah comes to correct that from the root. Then comes the statement that goes straight to the deepest fear no one dared to name. Allah had not left, and Allah had not hated. Not anymore, but never. That previous silence is not denied, but put into its rightful place. It was not the end. It was a pause in a longer song. Surah Ad-Duha does more than answer one moment. It reshapes the meaning of everything that happened. The months without revelation are not called useless and not treated as a meaningless void. They become a season of preparation, when the heart expands, when dependence on Allah is purified, when every other support is removed so only the pure bond remains. Then Allah turns the Prophet, peace be upon him, back to his own story. Not for nostalgia, but to rebuild confidence with living evidence. An orphan was sheltered, a seeker was guided. A life that once lacked was given enough. Every stage carried fingerprints of constant care, never random, never disconnected. This is the key. When you look back through the lens of Surah Ad-Duha, the silence does not look like an exception anymore. It looks like part of the consistent way Allah nurtures, prepares, and leads. What once felt like loss now looks like transition. What once hurt now carries the shape of wisdom. And the surah does not stop at comfort. It opens the horizon forward, not as instant success, but as a long promise, a promise that what is coming will be greater than what has passed. That what the Prophet, peace be upon him, endured is not a measure of the mission's worth, but a bridge towards something bigger. Allah's tone in Surah Ad-Duha does not sound like a judge. It sounds like the voice of the one who fully understands the human heart, what it feels like to be misunderstood, to wait, to sit in silence too long. Every line carries a gentleness that is intentional, not to soothe temporarily, but to rebuild a stronger spiritual foundation. And here is where the meaning of the silence becomes complete. It no longer feels like something to merely survive. It becomes something that has finished its work. It created a heart deep enough to receive light differently now. Not the shock of first revelation, but the light of understanding, stability, and faith that has walked through darkness without breaking. Surah Ad-Duha is not only the return of words from the unseen, it is the moment the bond between Allah and His Messenger moves into a deeper layer, no longer carried by emotion but by understanding, no longer dependent on constant reassurance but grounded in absolute trust. From that point on, silence no longer had to be feared. It became memory. And that memory, instead of wounding, became a foundation for an even harder road ahead. Surah Ad-Duha does not end with a pleasant feeling. It ends with a heavy responsibility. And that shows something important. Allah's comfort is never meant to trap a person in their safe zone. It always pushes them outward, toward others, carrying what they received in their darkest days. After calming the Prophet's heart, peace be upon him, after redefining silence, after restoring certainty that Allah had never left or hated, the surah shifts. It becomes guidance, because a faith that only receives comfort but never turns into action is still unfinished. Allah does not command something distant or unrealistic. No showy task, no impossible mission. The commands connect directly to the Prophet's own painful experiences. The one who was once an orphan is told not to mistreat the orphan. The one who knows what it is to wait in spiritual emptiness is told not to push away the one who asks, whether asking for help or asking for guidance. A profound principle appears here. Pain is not allowed to end in itself. If it stays only as suffering, it becomes a burden. But if it transforms into sensitivity toward other people's pain, it becomes light. What the Prophet endured was not wasted. It was returned to the community as mercy, responsibility, and service. Then comes the final command, simple on the surface and deep at the core. Speak about the blessings of Allah. Not to show off. Not to glorify yourself, but to remind the human heart that it did not walk through darkness alone. Naming blessings is not just communication, it is a healing of memory. When a person recognizes what they have been given, old wounds stop controlling the story of their life. This is where Surah Ad-Duha becomes a pattern for every era, because anyone in any time can fall into similar silences. Seasons of prayer without visible response. Moments when faith feels dry, mechanical, exhausted. Times when you wonder if your effort is still seen. This surah does not promise those silences will never return, but it declares they are not meaningless. They are not proof of an ending. Often they are proof of a transition. When familiar comforts are removed, a person is forced to go deeper, forced to rely on Allah not because of emotion, but because of trust. And this surah refuses to separate faith from real life. It does not allow believers to disappear into private spirituality and forget the world. It calls them outward with a heart refined by struggle. Caring for the vulnerable is not just a social act. It is the direct result of having once needed care yourself. Helping the one who asks is not random kindness. It is the continuation of mercy you once received. For the Prophet, peace be upon him, these commands were not new. But after the silence, they carried a new layer. They were no longer just duties. They became a reflection of the bond between him and Allah. A bond tested by fire, strengthened in darkness, and now steadier than ever. For people today, Surah Ad-Duha asks a hard question. What do we do with our dark seasons? Do we let them turn into bitterness and blame and isolation? Or do we let them widen the heart and soften it toward others? This surah teaches that real light is not when all hardship disappears. Real light is when a person learns to carry light into the places that once felt dark. And sometimes Allah lets someone walk through silence not because they are weak, but because they are being prepared to become a refuge for someone else inside that same silence. In the end, Surah Ad-Duha leaves a quiet but powerful message. Suffering is not a sentence, it is an invitation into a higher level of spiritual maturity, where faith does not depend on feelings but shows itself through action, service, and living gratitude. And when a person reaches that place, the silences that once terrified them stop being darkness. They become foundation for a faith that has learned to stand, even when the sky says nothing. If this story reached you and you want to keep exploring sacred lessons from prophetic history, join the Prophetic History Explained community to go deeper into faith, history, and spiritual healing. And do not forget to subscribe to support us, so we can keep bringing more meaningful, honest, and deeply written videos in the episodes ahead.